What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors meets a host who's gone too far? You won't believe what unfolds when Morgan Freeman sits down for what was supposed to be a routine late-night interview, only to find himself face-to-face with a confrontation that would leave audiences stunned and social media in complete chaos. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below because you're not going to believe what unfolds. Last night's episode of Jimmy Kimmel Live started like any other. The cameras rolled, the audience applauded, and Morgan Freeman walked onto the stage with his characteristic dignified stride, that unmistakable voice already drawing cheers from the crowd. Freeman, promoting his latest documentary project about climate change and social justice, seemed relaxed as he settled into the guest chair. The 76-year-old Oscar winner had done countless interviews over his decades-long career, and this appeared to be just another routine stop on the publicity circuit. But Jimmy Kimmel had other plans. From the moment Freeman sat down, something felt different. Kimmel's usual opening banter carried an edge that seasoned talk show viewers would recognize as trouble brewing. The host's smile seemed forced, his laugh a bit too loud, and his questions carried an underlying current of skepticism that immediately put the legendary actor on guard. "So, Morgan," Kimmel began, leaning back in his chair with that smirk that his critics know all too well, "you're here talking about climate change again. Tell me, how many private jets did you take to get here tonight?" The audience laughed nervously, but Freeman's expression remained steady, though a flicker of surprise crossed his weathered features. Freeman maintained his composure, responding with his trademark calm authority. "I actually drove here tonight, Jimmy, and I think the real question isn't how we travel, but whether we're willing to have honest conversations about the future we're leaving for our children." His response was measured, professional, but there was steel beneath the silk of his famous voice. Kimmel wasn't deterred. Right, but come on, Morgan. You live in a mansion that probably uses more electricity in a month than most families use in a year. Isn't there something a little hypocritical about lecturing regular people about their carbon footprint while you're living like that?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Freeman's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and those in the front rows of the studio audience could see his hands clasped more tightly in his lap. This wasn't the respectful interview format that A-list celebrities expect when they agree to appear on these shows. This was something else entirely. "Jimmy," Freeman said, his voice carrying a warning that anyone familiar with his dramatic roles would recognize, "I've spent the last 15 years of my life using my platform to raise awareness about issues that matter. I've donated millions to environmental causes, supported renewable energy initiatives, and yes, I've changed my own lifestyle significantly. But more importantly, I've used my voice to amplify scientists and activists who are doing the real work." Kimmel interrupted with a theatrical wave of his hand. "Oh, here we go with the using my platform speech. Look, I get it. You're Morgan Freeman. Your voice could make reading a phone book sound profound. But don't you think maybe, just maybe, regular folks are tired of being lectured by millionaire celebrities who fly around the world telling them to ride bicycles?" The studio audience was now completely silent. The usual laughter and applause that punctuates late-night television had evaporated, replaced by attention so thick it was almost visible. Freeman sat perfectly still, but his eyes had narrowed slightly, and anyone who knew him could see that the legendary actor's famous patience was being tested in ways it rarely had been in decades of public appearances. Camera operators zoomed in closer, sensing that something unprecedented was about to unfold. The production assistants in the control room exchanged worried glances. This wasn't going according to any script they'd seen, and Freeman's publicist, watching from the green room, had already pulled out her phone. "Jimmy," Freeman said, his voice dropping to that low register that had narrated countless documentaries and delivered some of cinema's most memorable lines, "I think you're confusing advocacy with lecture. When I talk about climate change, I'm talking about science. When I talk about social justice, I'm talking about basic human dignity. These aren't political talking points. These are conversations about survival and fairness. Kimmel leaned forward, sensing an opportunity to push harder. But that's exactly what I'm talking about, Morgan. You say science and human dignity like they're these sacred things that can't be questioned. Like anyone who disagrees with your version of these issues is some kind of ignorant fool. Don't you think that's a little condescending? Freeman's response was swift and sharp. What I think is condescending, Jimmy, is a talk show host who invites guests on his program under false pretenses, then uses his platform to attack them rather than engage in genuine dialogue. I came here to discuss a documentary that took 3 years to make that highlights the work of scientists and activists around the world. Instead, you seem more interested in scoring cheap points. The words hit like a thunderclap. Kimmel's face flushed red, and his carefully maintained television persona began to crack. The audience could sense that the carefully choreographed world of late-night television was about to explode into something raw and unscripted. False pretenses? Kimmel shot back, his voice rising. I'm asking you questions that millions of Americans want answered. Maybe you're just not used to anyone pushing back against your Morgan Freeman mystique. Freeman stood up slightly in his chair, and for a moment the full weight of his presence filled the studio. Here was an actor who had played presidents, and gods who had commanded respect on screen for over 5 decades, and who was clearly not going to be intimidated by a late-night comedian having a bad night. My mystique? Freeman's voice carried a dangerous quiet that made everyone in the studio lean forward. Jimmy, I've been in this business longer than you've been alive. I've sat across from journalists, directors, and yes, talk show hosts who understood that an interview is supposed to be a conversation, not an ambush. The confrontation was reaching a boiling point, and everyone in the studio could feel it building toward something that would change everything. Kimmel's laugh came out harsh and bitter, nothing like his usual television chuckle. Oh, so now I'm too young and inexperienced to question the great Morgan Freeman? Is that how this works in Hollywood? You reach a certain level of fame and suddenly you're above criticism? His voice carried a mocking tone that sent ripples of discomfort through the audience. Freeman's eyes flashed with something that hadn't been seen in his decades of public appearances. Genuine anger beginning to surface beneath his legendary composure. This isn't criticism, Jimmy. This is a hit job. And frankly, it says more about you than it does about me. The words were delivered with precision, each syllable carrying the weight of a man who had commanded respect on stages and screens around the world. The studio cameras captured every micro-expression as the tension escalated beyond anything the production crew had ever witnessed. Kimmel's producers were frantically whispering into their headsets, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let this unprecedented moment play out. The audience sat in stunned silence, realizing they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. A hit job? Kimmel's voice cracked slightly as he stood up behind his desk, his usual seated authority apparently not enough for what he was about to unleash. I'm asking you the questions that regular Americans ask when they see celebrities like you preaching about sacrifice while living in luxury. That's called journalism, Morgan. Maybe you've been surrounded by yes men for so long you forgot what real questions sound like. Freeman slowly rose from his chair, and suddenly the dynamic in the studio shifted dramatically. At 6 feet 2 inches, the veteran actor towered over the seated audience, his presence filling the space in a way that reminded everyone why he had played authority figures and moral leaders throughout his career. When he spoke, his voice carried the full weight of his decades in the industry. Real questions? Freeman's tone was dangerously quiet, the kind of quiet that precedes storms. Jimmy, a real question would be about the content of the documentary, about the scientists we interviewed, about the solutions being proposed by people far smarter than either of us. What you're doing is turning serious issues into a circus for your own entertainment. Kimmel wasn't backing down. If anything, Freeman's commanding presence seemed to fuel his aggression. Entertainment? You think this is entertainment? I think what's entertaining is watching a Hollywood elite get uncomfortable when someone doesn't bow down to their celebrity status. You came on my show, Morgan. My show, my rules. The phrase, my show, my rules, echoed through the studio like a gauntlet. Thrown down, Freeman's expression hardened, and those who knew his work could see echoes of some of his most powerful dramatic roles. The quiet authority of characters who had faced down injustice and refused to be intimidated. Your show, Freeman repeated, slowly tasting the words. And is this how you treat all your guests, Jimmy? Or just the ones who actually care about something beyond ratings and cheap laughs? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and every person in the studio could feel the shift from uncomfortable interview to something approaching a verbal duel. Kimmel's face was now fully flushed, his carefully maintained television persona completely abandoned. You know what, Morgan? Maybe I do treat people differently when they come on here, acting like they're better than everyone else. When they use their platform to lecture working families about their lifestyle choices while they live in compounds and travel in private jets. I haven't owned a private jet in over 8 years, Freeman said, his voice cutting through Kimmel's rant like a blade. I sold it specifically because I realized it was inconsistent with the message I was trying to send. But you didn't bother to research that, did you, Jimmy? Because actual facts might have gotten in the way of your predetermined narrative. The revelation hit the studio like a bomb. Kimmel's attack had been based on assumptions, and Freeman had just systematically dismantled his host's credibility in front of a live audience and millions of viewers. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft hum of the studio equipment and the barely audible whispers of audience members who couldn't believe what they were witnessing. Kimmel's response came out strangled, desperate. Oh, so you sold one jet. Congratulations. I'm sure the polar bears are throwing you a parade. What about the mansion? What about the fleet of cars? What about the fact that your carbon footprint is still probably 50 times bigger than a normal person's? Freeman took a step closer to Kimmel's desk, and the physical movement sent a ripple of tension through the entire studio. Here was a man who had portrayed presidents, generals, and moral authorities, and every inch of his bearing reminded the room of that gravitas. Jimmy, Freeman said, his voice now carrying the full authority of his 7 decades of life and 5 decades in the entertainment industry. Let me tell you what I see here. I see a talk show host who invited me on his program under false pretenses, who clearly had no intention of conducting a respectful interview, and who seems more interested in creating controversy than having a meaningful conversation about issues that will affect every person in this studio and every person watching at home. The words landed like physical blows. Kimmel was visibly shaken, but his response revealed just how far he was willing to go. False pretenses? I told your people. We wanted to talk about your project. I never promised to kiss your ring while I did it. Maybe the problem isn't my questions, Morgan. Maybe the problem is that you can't handle being treated like a regular person instead of Hollywood royalty. Freeman's laugh was sharp and humorless. Hollywood royalty? Jimmy, I grew up in Memphis, Mississippi. I served in the Air Force. I worked as a dancer, a transcript clerk, and drove a taxi in New York City before I ever set foot on a movie set. I know exactly what it's like to be a regular person, because that's what I was for the first 30 years of my life. The personal revelation seemed to momentarily stun Kimmel, but he recovered quickly, his desperation making him even more aggressive. Oh, here comes the humble origin story. The "I'm just like you" speech from someone who probably hasn't pumped his own gas in 20 years. That was the moment when everyone in the studio realized that Jimmy Kimmel had crossed a line from which there would be no return. Freeman's expression changed completely, the last vestiges of diplomatic patience evaporating as something much more dangerous took its place. Freeman stepped forward until he was directly beside Kimmel's desk, his towering presence casting a shadow over the host who suddenly looked very small behind his flimsy television furniture. When Freeman spoke, his voice carried a quiet intensity that made every person in the studio lean forward to catch every word. "Jimmy," Freeman said, his famous voice now stripped of all warmth and carrying the full weight of controlled fury. "In 50 years of this business, I have sat across from journalists who ask tough questions with respect, directors who pushed me to my limits with professionalism, and yes, talk show hosts who knew the difference between challenging an interview and humiliating a guest. You clearly don't understand that difference." Kimmel, perhaps realizing for the first time that he had pushed one of Hollywood's most respected figures too far, attempted to regain control. "Morgan, look, I'm just—" "No." Freeman's voice cut through Kimmel's attempt at backpedaling like a sword through paper. "You don't get to Morgan me now. You don't get to pretend this was legitimate journalism after what you just did. You brought me here under false pretenses. You attacked my character with information you couldn't be bothered to verify. And then when I corrected your errors, you doubled down with personal insults." The studio was now completely silent except for Freeman's voice, which seemed to fill every corner of the space. The audience sat transfixed, watching one of cinema's greatest actors deliver what was clearly going to be remembered as one of the most devastating on-air confrontations in television history. "You want to know about pumping gas, Jimmy?" Freeman continued, his voice rising slightly but maintaining that terrifying control. "I pumped gas in Memphis when I was 16 years old to help support my family. I cleaned offices at night while taking acting classes during the day. I lived in a one-room apartment in New York City for 8 years before I got my first real break. But that doesn't fit your narrative, does it? It's easier to paint me as some out-of-touch elite than to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, someone can succeed and still remember where they came from." Kimmel's face had gone from red to pale, and his usual quick wit seemed to have completely deserted him. He opened his mouth to respond, but Freeman wasn't finished. "You know what the real tragedy is here, Jimmy? I came on your show because I believed you genuinely wanted to discuss important issues. Climate change isn't a liberal conspiracy. It's science. Social justice isn't celebrity virtue signaling. It's basic human decency. But instead of having that conversation, you chose to turn this into some twisted performance art where you get to play the voice of the common man against the Hollywood elite." Freeman paused, letting his words sink in, and the silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. When he continued, his voice carried a sadness that was somehow more devastating than his anger had been. "What's particularly disappointing is that you have a platform that reaches millions of people. You could use it to actually inform, to educate, to elevate the conversation. Instead, you chose to use it for this." He gestured around the studio with obvious disgust. "This cheap theater." Kimmel finally found his voice, but it came out weak and defensive. "Morgan, look, these are legitimate questions that people—" "Stop!" Freeman's single word carried such authority that Kimmel immediately fell silent. "Just stop. Don't hide behind 'people want to know' or 'I'm just asking questions.' Own what you did here tonight. You ambushed a guest for entertainment value, and when called out on it, you resorted to personal attacks and stereotypes." Freeman began walking toward the edge of the stage, and panic flashed across Kimmel's face as he realized his guest was about to leave. "Morgan, wait! We're not finished!" Freeman turned back, and the look he gave Kimmel was one that anyone who had seen his dramatic work would recognize. The same expression he wore when playing characters who had reached their absolute limit, with injustice and stupidity. "Oh, we're finished, Jimmy. We were finished the moment you decided to treat this interview like a roast instead of a conversation. We were finished when you chose confrontation over curiosity. We were finished when you proved that you're more interested in being right than being informed." The studio cameras captured every moment as Freeman walked to the front of the stage and addressed the audience directly, bypassing Kimmel entirely. His voice, when he spoke to the crowd, carried none of the anger he had directed at the host. Instead, it held the warmth and dignity that had made him one of America's most beloved actors. "Ladies and gentlemen," Freeman said, his famous voice filling the studio, "I apologize that you had to witness this. You came here expecting entertainment, maybe some laughs, perhaps some interesting conversation about issues that matter to all of us. Instead, you got to see what happens when a talk show host confuses aggression with journalism." He paused, looking around the studio at the faces of audience members who were clearly torn between excitement at witnessing television history and discomfort at the ugliness they had just seen. "For those of you who are interested in learning about climate change, about the science, about the solutions being developed by brilliant minds around the world, I encourage you to seek out that information from actual experts, not from late-night television hosts who seem more interested in scoring points than solving problems." Kimmel, finally realizing that his show was completely spiraling out of his control, made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Morgan, come on, let's just—" Freeman didn't even turn around. "No, Jimmy, I don't think so. I've been in this business long enough to know when someone is acting in good faith and when they're not. Tonight, you showed everyone exactly who you are. I'm not going to stick around to watch you try to spin this into something it wasn't." With that, Freeman walked off the stage with the same dignity he had brought to countless red carpets, award shows, and movie premieres. The studio erupted in confused applause, some audience members clapping for Freeman's principled stand, others uncertain about what they had just witnessed, and still others sitting in stunned silence. Kimmel was left alone at his desk, his face flushed and his usual television confidence completely shattered. He looked out at the audience, then at the cameras, clearly struggling to figure out how to proceed with a show that had just imploded in spectacular fashion. "Well," Kimmel said weakly, his voice barely audible over the confused murmur of the audience, I guess we'll be right back after this commercial break." But as the cameras cut away and the studio lights dimmed for the commercial break, everyone in that building knew that this wasn't just the end of a disastrous interview. It was the end of Jimmy Kimmel's reputation as a host who could handle big-name guests with professionalism and respect. Freeman had walked out, but he had left behind a devastating indictment of everything wrong with modern celebrity journalism and late-night television culture. The great Morgan Freeman had entered that studio as a guest promoting important work on climate change and social justice. He left as a man who had delivered one of the most powerful on-air takedowns in television history, reminding everyone what dignity looked like in the face of manufactured controversy and cheap entertainment. The confrontation was over, but the impact of what had just unfolded would reverberate far beyond that studio, leaving Kimmel to face the consequences of the night he tried to ambush one of Hollywood's most respected figures, and learned, far too late, that some people simply refuse to be diminished.